The Quiet Revolution, How Nonviolence Changed the World. A note to the listener. Below is a lengthy, multi-part narrative history of ahimsa, the principle of nonviolence, as it has been envisioned and practiced around the world. To make it more readable within the constraints of this format, it is divided into sections and subsections, weaving a chronological thread from the ancient origins of the Jain concept through various cultures and religious philosophies to modern exemplars like Mahatma Gandhi and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Each section builds on the preceding narrative, exploring the lives of individuals and communities who have upheld or been inspired by nonviolence. While no single text can exhaustively cover every manifestation of nonviolence in human history, this account provides a broad tapestry of events and people united by the principle of peaceful coexistence and conflict resolution. Part 1. Early Roots of Nonviolence. 1. Indus Valley to Early Vedic Traditions. A dawn of civilization. The earliest conceptions of nonviolence may have existed long before written records, as humans developed the moral intuition that avoidable harm was undesirable. If we look as far back as the Indus Valley Civilization, c. 3300–1300 BCE, in what is now parts of modern-day Pakistan and northwest India, we see hints of a sophisticated society with planned cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, advanced drainage systems, and a relatively peaceful distribution of resources. Although there is little direct evidence that they had a codified doctrine akin to ahimsa, archaeological records, less fortifications and fewer weapons, suggest this civilization may have placed emphasis on communal cooperation rather than warfare. Early Vedic period. As the Indus Valley Civilization declined and new groups migrated, the Vedic period, roughly 1500–500 BCE, began. Vedic literature, notably the Rig Veda, Samaveda, Yajurveda and Atharva Veda, doesn't explicitly command nonviolence, but it lays moral and social foundations later shaped by Upanishadic philosophy. Hinduism would gradually emerge from these Vedic roots, and while certain rituals involved animal sacrifice, later segments of this tradition would propose vegetarianism and minimal harm to living beings. Non-violence was not yet systematized, but one can see glimmers of the idea that life is interconnected, and that intentional harm has consequences. 2. The emergence of Jainism and the formalization of ahimsa. Mahavira's life and context. By the 6th century BCE, one of the profound developments in religious and ethical thought occurred on the Indian subcontinent, the emergence of Jainism, a movement contemporaneous with early Buddhism. Mahavira, traditionally dated 599–527 BCE, though some scholars argue slightly different dates, the 24th Tirthankara or Fordmaker, crystallized Jain teachings into a coherent path. His real name, Vardhamana, was born into a noble family in what is present-day Bihar, in eastern India. According to Jain tradition, he abandoned his princely status in pursuit of spiritual awakening. For 12 years, Mahavira lived as an ascetic, undergoing intense penances and meditations that demanded self-discipline and an unwavering commitment to non-violence in thought, word, and deed. His spiritual breakthroughs led him to Kevala Jnana, the highest form of knowledge in Jain philosophy, and with that, an absolute understanding of the cosmos. The concept of ahimsa in Jain philosophy. The term ahimsa, derived from the Sanskrit root hims, meaning to strike, generally translates as the absence of harm. In Jainism, it is elevated to a central tenet, deeply connected with karma theory. Every act of harm generates negative karmic consequences that attach to the soul, hindering its liberation. Jain householders, who must still participate in everyday life, are bound by anuvrata, small vows, that include a commitment to minimize harm, while Jain monks adopt the more rigorous Mahavrata, great vows. These latter vows include strict vegetarianism, gentle speech, thoughtful movement to avoid trampling insects, and in some sects, the use of cloth mouth coverings to prevent inadvertent harm to airborne microbes. This radical emphasis on non-harm, not just to humans but to all living beings, revolutionized the ethical discourse of the time. It offered a transformative worldview. Rather than seeking dominion over nature and other creatures, one should practice restraint, compassion, and empathy, 3. Ahimsa's influence in ancient India. Buddha and parallels to Jainism. Gautama Buddha, traditionally 563–483 BCE, was a younger contemporary of Mahavira, born as Prince Siddhartha Gautama. While Buddhism and Jainism differ doctrinally, Buddhism focuses on the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, with less extreme austerity. Both traditions hold compassion, karuna, and non-harm, ahimsa, in high esteem. Buddhism thus echoed the Jain emphasis on not killing and not causing suffering. Although Buddhism did not adopt the meticulous level of non-violence found in Jain asceticism, it nonetheless shaped entire civilizations with a strong sense of empathy and kindness to all sentient beings, from Vedic ritual to moral precepts. As Hindu society evolved, the concept of non-violence trickled into mainstream practice. The influence of ascetic movements, whether Jain or Buddhist, curbed certain Vedic sacrifices, fostered widespread vegetarianism, and created a culture in which the moral discourse included compassion towards all beings. Philosophical texts like the Upanishads, particularly the Chandogya and Brihadaranyaka, explored the unity of the self, Atman, with the cosmic reality, Brahman, suggesting that to harm another being was, in some metaphysical sense, to harm oneself. Thus, by approximately 500 BCE, large sections of the Indian subcontinent were fertile ground for the concept of ahimsa, no longer a fringe idea, but increasingly accepted in mainstream moral thought. Part 2. Jain concept of ahimsa in depth. 1. Mahavira and the early Jain community. The rigors of ascetic life. Mahavira's unwavering commitment to non-violence, central to Jain ascetic practice, manifested in numerous daily rituals. Jain hagiographies recount episodes demonstrating his refusal to retaliate against aggression. He endured ridicule, physical attacks, extreme weather, and more, yet responded with equanimity and compassion. This demeanor demonstrated a revolutionary approach to conflict resolution, not by force or even verbal sparring, but by steadfast patience and non-reaction. Spread of the teachings. In Mahavira's wake, Jain monks, particularly those of the Shvetambara and Digambara traditions, wandered across the subcontinent, teaching at local gatherings and philosophical assemblies. Over centuries, monastic orders developed a system of ethics for laity and ascetics alike, clarifying how to practice non-violence in everyday life. From the use of gentle speech, to avoid injuring others emotionally, to mindful behavior while walking, to avoid accidentally killing insects, Jain adherence to non-violence permeated every aspect of life. 2. Jain communities through the ages. The Mauryan Empire and Emperor Ashoka. While Emperor Ashoka, 304–232 BCE, is best known as a patron of Buddhism, his reign left a lasting impact on how the subcontinent approached the principle of non-violence. After the bloody Kalinga War, said 261 BCE, traumatized him, Ashoka became deeply penitent and embraced a policy of dharma that valued compassion for all living beings. Though historically we consider Ashoka as the Buddhist emperor, Jain monks also found patronage under him. In edicts carved on rocks and pillars across his empire, Ashoka extolled the virtue of treating all creatures kindly, building veterinary clinics for animals, and encouraging people to reduce the slaughter of animals. The environment Ashoka fostered helped Jain communities flourish. Jain influence in trade and commerce. Jain laypersons, bound by their vow to minimize harm, often gravitated to mercantile or banking professions, occupations that did not necessitate violence. As trade routes expanded across the subcontinent, Jain merchants were known for their ethical dealings and philanthropic endeavors, founding schools, hospitals, and rest houses for travelers. Their success and charitable nature in turn elevated Jainism's prestige, enabling Jain communities to survive and grow even under changing political regimes, Jain acharyas, and scholarly contributions. Over the centuries, Jain monks authored vast treatises on philosophy, mathematics, grammar, and more. Figures like Umaswati, ca 2nd century CE, who wrote the Tattvartha Sutra, systematized Jain epistemology and ethics. Texts like these served as reference points for subsequent centuries of Jain scholarship. Moreover, the principle of ahimsa undergirded not only moral behavior, but also logic and epistemology. Jains developed Anekantavada, the doctrine of many-sidedness, recognizing that truth can be perceived differently from different perspectives. This multi-perspectival approach is aligned with a nonviolent attitude toward knowledge itself. Dogmatism can be a form of aggression. 3. Sectarian developments and preservation of ahimsa. Digambara and Shvetambara sects. The two main sects of Jainism, Digambara, meaning sky-clad, and Shvetambara, white-clad, differ in monastic practice, scripture, and interpretations of theology. However, they both uphold ahimsa as the highest ethical principle. Digambara monks, who traditionally do not wear clothing, maintain that clothing fosters attachment, while Shvetambara monks wear simple white robes. These external differences aside, their shared devotion to nonviolence remains the bedrock of their identity. Interaction with other religions. Throughout centuries of coexistence with Hindu and Muslim rulers, Jain communities continued to model nonviolence. Despite occasional episodes of persecution or conflict, Jain states and kingdoms, such as those that arose in certain regions of India, rarely built armies of conquest and often served as mediators in interstate disputes. The cultural impact of Jain artistry, from temple architecture in places like Ranakpur and Dilwara to the spread of vegetarian cuisine, illustrates how deeply woven ahimsa is into the fabric of Indian society and beyond. By the medieval period, Jain philosophy of nonviolence was firmly established, influencing everyday practices of millions. This strong foundation set the stage for future thinkers to adapt, champion, and spread the doctrine, making ahimsa an important thread in global ethical discourse. Part 3. Buddhism, Hinduism, and other nonviolent traditions. 1. Buddhism's parallel emphasis on compassion. Gautama Buddha's biographical sketch. Born as a prince in the Shakya clan, Siddhartha Gautama was sheltered from suffering until he encountered sickness, old age, death, and asceticism. Deeply disturbed, he renounced the palatial life to seek liberation. After intense meditation, he attained enlightenment, Bodhi, and became the Buddha, the awakened one. He then preached the middle way, avoiding both extreme indulgence and extreme asceticism. The first precept: do not take life. Although the Buddhist path doesn't demand the austere forms of nonviolence found in Jainism, it does rest on 5 core moral precepts for lay followers, the first of which is to abstain from taking life. From its earliest spread in India to its travels across Asia, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, Tibet, China, Korea, Japan, Buddhism carried with it a prescription against violence towards sentient beings. Monastic communities often adopt vegetarian or vegan diets, though this varies geographically, and kindness to animals is a frequent hallmark of Buddhist majority regions. King Ashoka's enduring legacy. As mentioned, Emperor Ashoka's conversion to Buddhism had an immense cultural impact. His edicts inscribed on stone pillars across modern-day India, Nepal, and Pakistan speak of refraining from harming living beings, establishing hospitals for animals, and encouraging moral behavior. Ashoka's example, combining remorse for violence with institutional reforms, foreshadows modern leaders who have used state power to promote nonviolent ideals. 2. Hinduism's evolving attitude toward nonviolence. Origins and epics. Hinduism, a tradition with complex roots in the Vedas, Brahmanical schools and regional practices, does not uniformly demand strict nonviolence. Indeed, major Hindu epics like the Mahabharata revolve around warfare and questions of duty, dharma. The Bhagavad Gita presents Arjuna's moral dilemma on the battlefield. Should he fight against kinsmen who stand on the opposing side, or should he lay down arms? Krishna advises Arjuna to fulfill his kshatriya, warrior duty, but to do so with detachment and without hatred. This can be read as a theologically nuanced stance that violence can sometimes be performed without malice if it aligns with cosmic duty. However, the development of Vedanta philosophy, the rise of devotional, bhakti movements, and the influence of Jain and Buddhist nonviolence contributed to a strong undercurrent of ahimsa in Hindu practice. Countless Hindu saints and reformers, from Ramanuja to Chaitanya to Ramakrishna, emphasized compassion and love over conflict. Vegetarianism, practiced by millions of Hindus, likewise reflects a cultural assimilation of the principle of do not harm. 3. Nonviolence in other ancient civilizations. China, Confucianism, Taoism, and Mohism. Around the same period as the birth of Buddhism and Jainism in India, thinkers in China offered moral philosophies that touched on non-violent ideals, if not in the exact sense of ahimsa. Confucius, 551–479 BCE, stressed harmonious social relations, respect, and benevolence, Ren. While Confucianism doesn't forbid warfare outright, it does emphasize moral governance and the minimization of harm. Taoism, attributed to Laozi, 6th century BCE, advocates a life in harmony with the Tao, which often means avoiding force, competition, and aggression, thus mirroring certain aspects of nonviolent practice. Mohism, founded by Mozi, ca. 470–391 BCE, explicitly promoted the idea of universal love, which some scholars interpret as an early form of nonviolent philosophy. Mohists disapproved of offensive warfare, believing it to be morally wrong. These strands in Chinese thought collectively sowed seeds for peaceable solutions and ethical discourse on minimizing harm. Greece and Rome. The ancient Greeks and Romans had cultural ideals celebrating heroism in battle, but also philosophical discussions on justice and restraint. The Stoics, for instance, advocated self-control, emotional temperance, and acting in accordance with reason. While Stoicism doesn't equate to a doctrine of complete nonviolence, it suggests that one should not inflict unnecessary harm. One must preserve a sense of virtue and inner tranquility. Cynics and certain Pythagoreans practiced vegetarianism, possibly to avoid harming animals. In parallel, early Christian communities in the Roman Empire grappled with questions of pacifism versus just war. The figure of Jesus himself is often associated with an ethic of non-retaliation, exemplified by the Sermon on the Mount's injunction to turn the other cheek. 4. Intersections of ideas. By the end of the classical period, roughly 5th century CE, humankind had produced numerous moral and religious philosophies, many of which placed some emphasis on reducing violence. While few matched the rigor of Jain ascetic nonviolence, there was a steadily spreading understanding of harm as an ethical problem. Regions that came into contact through trade, such as India, the Middle East, China, and parts of the Mediterranean, exchanged philosophical insights, laying the groundwork for cross-cultural ideas that centuries later would shape global movements for peace. Part 4. Ahimsa in the medieval and early modern eras. 1. Jainism through the medieval period. Sustaining identity under changing dynasties. From the 7th to the 15th centuries, the Indian subcontinent was ruled by various dynasties, some Hindu, some Buddhist, some Jain-influenced, and later a series of Islamic sultanates. Jain communities, dedicated to trade and scholarship, often thrived as they provided valuable economic and literary services to different royal courts. Their vow of ahimsa distinguished them from other groups. While many societies valued martial prowess, Jain leadership generally avoided militarization. Temples such as the Dilwara temples on Mount Abu, 11–13 the centuries, exemplify the devotional artistry of Jains. These exquisite shrines, constructed using white marble, are themselves a testament to a form of artistic nonviolence. They revolve around serene images of Tirthankaras, inspiring worshippers to contemplate compassion and detachment rather than aggression. 2. Christian pacifism and medieval Europe. Early Church Fathers. In medieval Europe, Christian doctrine was deeply intertwined with state power, especially after Constantine's conversion in the early 4th century CE. Over time, the Church adapted doctrines of just war, balancing the teachings of Jesus on peace with the political necessities of the realm. However, there remained minority voices that advocated pacifism. Some monastic orders, like the Franciscans in the 13th century, emphasized poverty, humility, and compassion, though not always absolute nonviolence. Tolstoy's later influence. Count Leo Tolstoy, 1828–1910, might seem out of place in a medieval context, but his ideas have roots in certain strands of Christian pacifism. Writing in late 19th century Russia, he drew upon Christian teachings, especially the Sermon on the Mount, to advocate a radical form of nonviolence and rejection of state authority. Although not widely accepted in his own society, his writings influenced future figures like Mahatma Gandhi. Tolstoy stands as a transitional figure between medieval Christian mystics, who championed spiritual peace, and modern pacifist movements. 3. Islamic traditions of peace. Sufism and the inner jihad. While Islam spread rapidly from the 7th century onward, establishing empires and sultanates, it also fostered spiritual movements emphasizing love and peace. Sufism, the mystical dimension of Islam, often highlights the greater jihad, an internal struggle against the ego, as opposed to physical conflict. Masters like Jalaluddin Rumi, 1207–1273, wrote poetry urging union with the divine, transcending the illusions of selfhood that breed violence. Salam and the ethic of peace. The root of the word Islam is SLM, which relates to peace, wholeness, and submission to God. Many Islamic teachings, particularly those in the Hadith about mercy, encourage kindness to animals, forgiveness of enemies, and charitable acts. While Islamic political history includes conflicts and empire building, there were also periods and regions where Muslim rulers adopted policies of tolerance. For instance, the reign of Akbar the Great, 1542–1605, in Mughal India, is remembered for interfaith dialogues that included Hindus, Jains, Christians, and Sikhs, thereby contributing to a climate of relative harmony. 4. Nonviolence in East Asia. Buddhist kingdoms and dynasties. Across East and Southeast Asia, Buddhist monarchs like those in Sri Lanka, Thailand, Siam, and Burma, Myanmar, often promoted a policy of compassion in governance. The principle of ahimsa, or at least aversion to violence, was sometimes offset by political realities, but it still shaped cultural norms. In Japan, Zen Buddhism coexisted with the samurai class, creating a paradox of warrior monks at times, but also producing teachers who criticized needless bloodshed. Neo-Confucianism. In China, under the Song and Ming dynasties, a renewed interest in Confucianism, influenced by Buddhism and Taoism, led to Neo-Confucianism. While not an explicit call to nonviolence, this tradition's emphasis on moral cultivation, empathy, and social harmony can be interpreted as an inclination away from unnecessary violence. The bureaucratic exam system, focusing on Confucian ethics, also implicitly valued peaceable statesmanship over raw militarism. By the cusp of the early modern era, across many regions, India, the Islamic world, Christian Europe, and East Asia, there existed fertile moral soil in which a new global wave of nonviolence could emerge. The coming centuries, marked by colonial expansions, revolutions, and reform movements, would test these ideas on the world stage. Part 5. The Modern Seedbed, 18th to 19th centuries. 1. Enlightenment and rational approaches to peace. European philosophers. In the 18th century, the European Enlightenment introduced new discourses on human rights, natural law, and the social contract. Thinkers like Immanuel Kant, 1724–1804, spoke of perpetual peace, though he did not necessarily see states as relinquishing warfare easily. Jean-Jacques Rousseau questioned the morality of violence and tyranny, while Voltaire satirized religious conflicts and intolerance. Although these philosophers did not frame their arguments in the language of ahimsa, they pressed for reason and moral progress as an antidote to violent fanaticism. Quakers and the Peace Churches. Within Christianity, dissenting groups like the Religious Society of Friends, Quakers, Mennonites, and later the Church of the Brethren took pacifism as a core principle. Quakers, founded by George Fox in the mid-17th century, refused to bear arms or swear oaths, following a literal interpretation of Christ's call to refrain from violence. Over time, Quakers became known for social reform, involvement in abolitionism, and conscientious objection to wars. Their stance is one of the clearest expressions of Christian nonviolence in the West. 2. Colonial encounters and missions. India and the West. Starting in the 18th century, the British East India Company gradually took control of large parts of India. Western missionaries and reformers such as William Carey and Alexander Duff came into contact with India's diverse religious traditions, including Jainism. However, British imperial policies often relied on military power to maintain control. This paradox, where some Westerners brought moral or religious teachings while their governments pursued colonization, highlighted the complexities of promoting nonviolence in an imperial context. Ahimsa under threat. Jain and other nonviolent communities had to adapt. While the British did not target Jains specifically, the broader context of colonial exploitation undermined India's autonomy. Traditional ethical practices sometimes clashed with the demands of the colonial economy, yet the British period also allowed certain reform movements to flourish by providing new platforms such as print media and educational institutions. Thus, seeds of a modern resurgence of nonviolence were inadvertently planted. 3. American abolition and nonviolence. Slavery and the moral struggle. In the United States, the moral debate over slavery peaked in the early to mid-19th century. Pacifist abolitionists, like some Quakers and other Christian activists, refused to endorse violent uprisings but campaigned vigorously to end slavery through moral suasion, petitions, and civil disobedience. For example, William Lloyd Garrison was a strong advocate of non-resistance, as articulated in his editorial circle around the Liberator. Still, figures like John Brown took a more militant stance, underscoring that not all who opposed slavery were committed to nonviolence. Tolstoy's writings and global impact. Although Leo Tolstoy's major works, such as War and Peace, 1869, and Anna Karenina, 1878, are fictional, they reflect his evolving worldview. In his later life, Tolstoy wrote religious and philosophical tracts, The Kingdom of God is Within You, 1894, being especially pivotal, that championed a radical Christian anarchism and absolute pacifism. He communicated with individuals around the world, including a young Mohandas K. Gandhi, planting the seeds of a major global shift in how nonviolence could be used as an activist strategy rather than just a moral stance. 4. Reform movements in India. Brahmo Samaj, Arya Samaj, and other progressive groups. In the late 19th century, Indian reform movements such as the Brahmo Samaj, founded by Raja Ram Mohan Roy, and the Arya Samaj, founded by Swami Dayananda Saraswati, worked to modernize and revitalize Hindu society. While neither group was pacifist per se, their revivalism drew upon moral and spiritual insights that included compassion, social justice, and anti-caste sentiments. These movements laid part of the foundation for Gandhi's eventual marriage of social reform and nonviolent activism, reverberations of Jain and Buddhist ethics. Around this time, Jain communities also began to articulate their ancient principles of ahimsa in the context of modernization. Public conferences, increased literacy, and intellectual exchanges with Western thinkers broadened Jainism's reach. Though Jain doctrine had always been present, the novelty was in how these communities framed nonviolence as a solution to social and political struggles, bridging religious orthodoxy and modern activism. Approaching the dawn of the 20th century, then, the stage was set for a dramatic reimagining of ahimsa, not only as a personal or spiritual ethic, but as a potent force for massive social and political change. Part 6: Gandhi and the 20th Century Awakening. 1. Mahatma Gandhi, Life and Influences. Early life in Porbandar. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was born on October 2, 1869, in Porbandar, a coastal town in present-day Gujarat, India. Raised in a Hindu Vaishnav family, he was exposed to Jain influences, especially through his devout mother. As a child, Gandhi absorbed stories of compassion, ethical responsibility, and spiritual devotion, seeds that would later blossom into his unwavering commitment to ahimsa. Studies in London, experiences in South Africa. At 19, Gandhi travelled to London to study law. While there, he was introduced to a variety of spiritual and philosophical texts, including the Bhagavad Gita, Christian Gospels, and writings of Tolstoy. The Bhagavad Gita's theme of selfless action left a profound mark, and Tolstoy's emphasis on Christian nonviolence resonated deeply. In 1893, Gandhi moved to South Africa for a legal case and stayed for over 2 decades. During this period, he confronted racial discrimination firsthand, most famously being thrown off a first-class train compartment despite holding a valid ticket. Outraged yet determined, Gandhi began to experiment with nonviolent resistance, coining the term satyagraha, truth force or soul force, which integrated ahimsa with the pursuit of truth through active civil disobedience. Return to India and leadership. Gandhi returned to India in 1915, revered as a champion of Indian rights in South Africa. Inspired by the long-standing Jain tradition of ahimsa as well as Tolstoy's Christian pacifism, he refined his concept of nonviolent activism to tackle India's quest for independence from British rule. He led several campaigns: Champaran Satyagraha, 1917, fighting for indigo farmers; Kheda Satyagraha, 1918, for relief from taxes after famine, and soon became a central figure in the Indian National Congress, advocating Swaraj, self-rule, and Swadeshi, use of locally produced goods. 2. The philosophy and practice of Gandhian nonviolence. Spiritual underpinnings. For Gandhi, nonviolence was not merely a political tactic but a way of life. He believed in the unity of all living beings and saw violence as rooted in ignorance of this fundamental oneness. Influenced by the Jain vow of non-harm, Gandhi expanded the idea to include an active fight against injustice. Where Jain monks might avoid violence by detachment, Gandhi sought to transform society through compassion in action. The Salt March, 1930. One of the most iconic episodes of Gandhi's Satyagraha was the Salt March, also known as the Dandi March. To protest the British monopoly on salt production, Gandhi and a band of followers marched 240 miles to the coastal village of Dandi, where he produced salt from seawater in defiance of British law. This simple act galvanized a mass movement, with millions of Indians across the subcontinent defying the salt laws nonviolently. British authorities arrested tens of thousands, but the moral high ground remained with the Satyagrahis. International headlines marveled at the power of disciplined, principled nonviolence. Quit India movement, 1942. During World War II, Gandhi escalated his demands for British withdrawal, launching the Quit India movement. While the movement encountered some outbreaks of violence against Gandhi's wishes, the overarching spirit was one of mass civil disobedience. Leaders were jailed, communications disrupted, but the moral and political pressure became immense. By the time the war ended, Britain's resolve to hold India had diminished considerably. Partition and Gandhi's final days. India achieved independence in 1947, but partition into India and Pakistan led to communal violence. Heartbroken by the bloodshed between Hindus and Muslims, Gandhi undertook fasts to quell riots and preached reconciliation. On January 30, 1948, he was assassinated by Nathuram Godse, a Hindu nationalist who opposed Gandhi's accommodating stance towards Muslims. Gandhi's death shocked the world, yet his life left an indelible legacy, proving the efficacy and moral power of nonviolent struggle. 3. Global reverberations. Martin Luther King Jr. and Beyond. King's early formation. Born in 1929, Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister from Atlanta, Georgia. His leadership of the American civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s drew directly on Gandhian principles. King first encountered Gandhi's teachings through mentors like Howard Thurman, and after reading various accounts of Gandhi's civil disobedience campaigns, he saw parallels between India's struggle for independence and the African-American struggle for equality under Jim Crow segregation. Montgomery Bus Boycott, 1955-56. A seminal event in King's career was the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Triggered by Rosa Parks's arrest for refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger, African Americans in Montgomery, Alabama, organized a year-long boycott of city buses. King, then a 26-year-old pastor, emerged as a leader, urging participants to remain nonviolent despite intimidation and threats. Inspired by Gandhi, the protesters marched peacefully, faced arrests, and ultimately forced the city to desegregate buses. This victory showcased the potency of nonviolent mass action in the American context. March on Washington, 1963, and beyond. King continued to orchestrate nonviolent campaigns, sit-ins, freedom rides, voter registration drives, culminating in events like the March on Washington in August 1963, where he delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. His approach, firmly rooted in Christian love, agape, and Gandhian nonviolence, challenged the moral conscience of a nation. The Civil Rights Act, 1964, and Voting Rights Act, 1965, were political milestones partly achieved through these peaceful protests. Legacy and assassination. King's call extended beyond race relations to opposition to the Vietnam War, poverty, and social injustice writ large. On April 4, 1968, he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. Like Gandhi, King died while in service to a cause that sought to unify rather than divide. His legacy endures globally, with nonviolent activism becoming a template for subsequent movements against apartheid in South Africa, for democracy in Eastern Europe, and for various human rights campaigns worldwide. 4. Other voices of the 20th century. Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu. In South Africa, the anti-apartheid movement often resorted to armed struggle, especially through the African National Congress's armed wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe. Yet even amid violent resistance, leaders like Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu consistently emphasized reconciliation rather than vengeance. Although Mandela did not strictly follow Gandhian nonviolence, his stance post-imprisonment leaned heavily on peaceful negotiation and truth-telling. Archbishop Tutu, conversely, was a staunch advocate of nonviolent protest and led church-based campaigns for racial equality, culminating in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission after apartheid fell, Dalai Lama, and the Tibetan struggle. Tenzin Gyatso, the 14th Dalai Lama, fled Tibet in 1959 following the Chinese military crackdown. Anchored in Mahayana Buddhist tradition, which highlights compassion and nonviolence, the Dalai Lama advocated a middle-way approach, seeking genuine autonomy for Tibet within China but rejecting violent rebellion. His message of peace earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989, symbolizing the global resonance of nonviolence even in the face of seemingly insurmountable opposition. Thich Nhat Hanh and Engaged Buddhism. A Vietnamese Buddhist monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, 1926-2022, pioneered Engaged Buddhism, applying mindfulness and nonviolence to social and political contexts. During the Vietnam War, he organized humanitarian efforts and called for a peaceful resolution. Exiled for decades, Thich Nhat Hanh established monasteries around the world, teaching mindful living as a basis for compassionate engagement in activism. Cesar Chavez and farm workers' rights. In the United States, Cesar Chavez, 1927-1993, along with Dolores Huerta, led the United Farm Workers Union to fight for labor rights through nonviolent strikes and boycotts, such as the historic grape boycott of the late 1960s. Chavez, influenced by Catholic social teaching and Gandhi's satyagraha, deployed fasting and peaceful picketing to highlight the plight of migrant farm laborers. His approach galvanized public support and forced employers to negotiate better conditions and wages. The 20th century thus witnessed a remarkable global tapestry of leaders and movements practicing nonviolence in diverse contexts, from racial justice to labor rights, from colonial liberation to interfaith dialogues. Each was, in its own way, echoing the core insight of Jain ahimsa, that to injure another is ultimately to injure oneself, and that real transformation arises from the force of truth, not arms. Part 7. Nonviolence in the Contemporary World. 1. Post-1970s Peace and Justice Movements. Environmental activism. As ecological crises loom, many activists have adopted nonviolent resistance to protest deforestation, fossil fuel extraction, and pollution. Movements like Greenpeace use peaceful direct action, placing themselves in front of whaling ships or scaling smokestacks. This is an extension of ahimsa beyond human relationships to encompass the well-being of the planet and all its inhabitants. Feminist and LGBTQ+ movements. Starting in the late 20th century, feminist organizations and LGBTQ+ advocates often employed nonviolent demonstrations, pride parades, and legal challenges to confront discrimination. The Stonewall riots of 1969 in New York City, while not entirely nonviolent, launched a broader movement that would later utilize specific forms of protest, marches, vigils, political lobbying, to achieve legal recognition for same-sex relationships and ensure protection against discrimination. Occupy Wall Street, 2011. Sparked by economic inequalities and corporate greed, the Occupy movement in the United States used marches, encampments, and consensus-based deliberation to challenge systemic injustice. Although clashes with authorities occurred, the movement as a whole championed peaceful protest and dialogue, continuing the Gandhian and King tradition of civil disobedience. 2. Digital Age and Nonviolent Resistance. Arab Spring, 2010-2012. Social media platforms empowered citizens in Tunisia, Egypt, and other Middle Eastern and North African countries to organize large-scale protests against autocratic rulers. While some of these uprisings led to violent conflicts, the initial phases were often marked by mass peaceful demonstrations, sit-ins, and civil disobedience. The use of digital tools can be seen as a 21st century update to strategies pioneered by Gandhi and King, spreading information rapidly and coordinating protest logistics. Hong Kong protests. Between 2014, the Umbrella Movement, and 2019-20, Hong Kong saw waves of protests demanding democratic freedoms. Many protesters adhered to nonviolent principles, using creative strategies like Be Water, a flexible approach to demonstration, though the movement also saw an escalation of violence over time. Still, the emphasis on peaceful marches, symbolic umbrellas, and large-scale singing or chanting resonates with global traditions of nonviolent dissent. 3. Nonviolence training and theoretical frameworks. Gene Sharp's Strategic Nonviolent Action, an American political scientist, Gene Sharp, 1928-2018, authored works like From Dictatorship to Democracy, which systematically outline methods of nonviolent resistance. His 198 methods of nonviolent action range from protest and persuasion to non-cooperation and nonviolent intervention. Sharp's scholarship provides a secular blueprint for activists worldwide, drawing on historical precedents from Gandhi's India to the civil rights movement and beyond. The role of peace education. Organizations like the International Peace Research Association, Nonviolent Peace Force, and academic programs in peace and conflict studies have formalized the study of nonviolent strategies. They teach mediation, restorative justice, and conflict transformation. This academic turn underscores how ahimsa has evolved from a religious and philosophical ideal into a domain of professional expertise. 4. The continuing relevance of Jain philosophy. Modern Jain communities and outreach. Today, Jains are a minority in India, around 4–5 million, but continue to exert influence disproportionate to their numbers. Many are active in business, philanthropy, and interfaith dialogue. Jain organizations sponsor animal shelters, encourage veganism, and fund education initiatives. Some Jain ascetics and lay leaders reach out globally, presenting ahimsa as a practical ethic for global peace and environmental stewardship, intersecting global ethics. In an age of climate change, nuclear arms, and mass displacement, the Jain emphasis on the interconnectedness of all life resonates more urgently than ever. Concepts like Anekantavada, the multiplicity of viewpoints, offer a framework for dialogues between polarized groups. By acknowledging partial truths in every perspective, societies might reduce hostility and move toward compromise. Part 8. Biographical sketches and their impetus. The following section provides brief biographical overviews of key figures and groups who have employed ahimsa or nonviolent principles, along with the impetus driving them. Mahavira, 599–527 BCE, traditional dates. Background: 24th Tirthankara of Jainism, born into a noble family. Nonviolence impetus: spiritual quest for liberation from karmic cycles. Legacy: formalized ahimsa into a religion-wide ethic, influenced Buddhist and Hindu moral thinking. Gautama Buddha, 563–483 BCE, traditional dates. Background: Prince Siddhartha, sheltered youth, awakened to suffering. Nonviolence impetus: discovery that compassion is essential to end suffering. Legacy: the 5 precepts, monastic codes, and widespread adoption of peaceful ethics across Asia. Emperor Ashoka, 304–232 BCE. Background: Mauryan ruler, grandson of Chandragupta Maurya. Nonviolence impetus: remorse after witnessing mass bloodshed in the Kalinga War. Legacy: rock and pillar edicts championing kindness to humans and animals, founding hospitals, shaping ethical governance. Jesus of Nazareth, say 4 BCE, 30 CE. Background: Jewish preacher, central figure of Christianity. Nonviolence impetus: Sermon on the Mount teachings emphasizing love, forgiveness, and turning the other cheek. Legacy: inspired centuries of Christian pacifists, monastic orders, and peace churches. Prophet Muhammad, 570–632 CE. Background: trader in Mecca, founder of Islam. Nonviolence impetus: although Islam often had to defend itself militarily, the Quranic emphasis on mercy, rahmah, and the concept of salam, peace, shaped an ethic of restraint in conflict. Legacy: Sufi movements and others highlight peace as central to spiritual life. Complexities in Islamic jurisprudence about just warfare. Leo Tolstoy, 1828–1910. Background: Russian novelist and moral philosopher. Nonviolence impetus: interpretation of the Gospels emphasizing non-resistance to evil, personal moral crises after witnessing war. Legacy: influenced Gandhi, Christian anarchist movements, and modern pacifism. Mahatma Gandhi, 1869–1948. Background: lawyer, activist in South Africa, returned to India to lead independence struggle. Nonviolence impetus: synthesis of Jain ahimsa, Christian pacifism, and Hindu devotionalism. Legacy: proved the political potency of mass nonviolent resistance. Model for civil rights movements worldwide. Martin Luther King Jr., 1929–1968. Background: Baptist minister from Atlanta, Georgia, central leader of the U.S. civil rights movement. Nonviolence impetus: Christian theology of love and justice, direct study of Gandhi's methods. Legacy: civil rights legislation in the U.S., global symbol of peaceful protest against racism. Nelson Mandela, 1918–2013. Background: South African anti-apartheid revolutionary, imprisoned 27 years. Nonviolence impetus: complex, originally endorsed armed struggle, but eventually embraced reconciliation to prevent civil war. Legacy: oversaw a peaceful transition from apartheid to democracy, champion of forgiveness and unity. Desmond Tutu, 1931–2021. Background: South African Anglican bishop, social rights activist. Nonviolence impetus: deep Christian faith, moral outrage at apartheid, emphasis on Ubuntu, shared humanity. Legacy: moral leadership in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, advocacy of dialogue and non-retaliation. Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, b. 1935. Background: spiritual leader of Tibetan Buddhism, exiled from Tibet. Nonviolence impetus: Mahayana Buddhist compassion, belief in dialogue and the middle way. Legacy: Nobel Peace Prize recipient, global voice for peaceful conflict resolution, interfaith harmony. Thich Nhat Hanh, 1926–2022. Background: Vietnamese Zen master, peace activist during Vietnam War. Nonviolence impetus: engaged Buddhism, mindful living and compassionate action. Legacy: writings on mindfulness, global monastic communities, Plum Village, bridging Eastern and Western spiritual practices. Cesar Chavez, 1927–1993. Background: Mexican-American farm worker, labor leader. Nonviolence impetus: Catholic faith, example of Gandhi, commitment to workers' dignity. Legacy: unionization of farm workers, improved labor conditions, introduced fasting as a protest technique. Each of these figures or groups, despite operating in vastly different cultural and historical contexts, found in nonviolence not just a passive stance, but a transformative force. Part 9. Conclusion and Reflections. The Arc of Nonviolence. From the ancient asceticism of Jain monks to modern mass movements against systemic injustice, the idea of ahimsa or nonviolence has traveled a remarkable historical arc. Whether rooted in spiritual metaphysics, as in Jainism and Buddhism, moral teachings of major religions, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, or secular philosophy, Tolstoy, Gene Sharp, the essence remains the same: intentional harm to another is both ethically abhorrent and ultimately self-defeating. Universal lessons, interconnectedness. Almost every nonviolent tradition highlights the deep interconnectedness of life. Jains see all living beings as souls on a path to liberation. Buddhists emphasize that suffering is universal and must be alleviated by compassion. Christians speak of universal brotherhood under God, active resistance. Nonviolence should not be mistaken for passivity. Gandhi called it satyagraha, adherence to truth through assertive yet peaceful struggle. King's marches and boycotts disrupted unjust systems. These tactics reveal that nonviolence is not submission, but a strategic choice grounded in moral power. Personal transformation. Another key aspect is self-purification. For Jain monks, meticulously avoiding harm is a spiritual discipline. For Gandhi, fasting was a way to strengthen resolve and empathize with the oppressed. For King, prayer and church gatherings fortified activists' commitment. In each case, personal transformation undergirds broader social change. Challenges and critiques. Critics argue that nonviolence can be slow, that it may fail to deter ruthless adversaries, or that it inadvertently privileges those already holding power. Certain movements have turned to violence when peaceful protests seem to yield little. Even Gandhi's methods did not prevent the partition bloodshed. King's nonviolent protests faced lethal opposition. Yet, in the long view, nonviolent struggles typically achieve more lasting reconciliation and moral legitimacy. Global relevance in the 21st century. In an era of nuclear proliferation, terrorism, racial and religious tensions, and environmental collapse, the question arises, is ahimsa still viable? For many activists and thinkers, nonviolence remains the only sustainable path to global peace. Violent solutions often create a cycle of retribution. Only a moral approach that respects all parties can hope to break that cycle. Climate activism, democratic reform movements, and social justice campaigns worldwide continue to rely on nonviolent protest, showing that ahimsa has not lost its power to inspire. A living tradition. The story of nonviolence is still unfolding. Mahavira, the Buddha, Jesus, Gandhi, King, each provided a template that subsequent generations reinterpreted to fit new challenges. Through institutions like peace research institutes, nonviolent training workshops, and global networks of activists, the spirit of ahimsa endures. It transcends religious, cultural, and national boundaries because, at its core, it calls upon the better angels of our nature, empathy, reason, and a recognition of our shared fate as inhabitants of a fragile planet. Final word. In the centuries to come, humankind will undoubtedly face crises demanding collective action and moral clarity. The principle of nonviolence, born in the ascetic folds of Jain monasticism, tested in political revolutions, championed by towering figures like Gandhi and King, and continually refined in movements around the globe, offers a profound roadmap. Whether we heed that roadmap may determine not only whether conflicts can be resolved without bloodshed, but whether we, as a species, can sustain the very conditions for life and liberty that ahimsa seeks to protect. Epilogue. Nonviolence has repeatedly proven its capacity to shift the course of nations and awaken the consciences of entire generations. From the disciplined ascetic steps of Jain monks centuries ago to the massive civil resistance campaigns of the modern era, ahimsa stands out as one of humanity's most enduring moral beacons. Rooted in the conviction that all life is fundamentally sacred and interconnected, it has shaped laws, overthrown oppressive regimes, and inspired countless acts of compassion. The legacy of ahimsa is not confined to ancient texts or distant historical episodes. It lives on in every peaceful protest, every act of civil disobedience that refuses to harm another, and every personal choice to practice compassion rather than violence. This ongoing story is, in the truest sense, our collective human narrative, one that, despite immense obstacles, continues to unfold with hope and resilience.